The House of Representatives voted to pass the Equality Act, a landmark bill that would ban discrimination against people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But it passed with little Republican support, and its fate in the Senate is unclear. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is an expert in American politics, professor of political science, and the director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University. And we thank you once again, Dr. Smith, for sharing that expertise with us.
It's my pleasure.
It's not the first time that this bill has been down this road. In fact, it passed the House with even greater Republican support in 2019. So, what is the Equality Act? How does it amend the Civil Rights Act? And what are the most significant changes?
So, the Equality Act has really been part of the Democratic agenda for quite some time. As you know, the Democrats have really appealed to the LGBTQ plus community in really important ways, I think, for more than a decade, honestly. The Equality Act is an effort to amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Obviously, that's a foundational act to our government's effort to prevent discrimination throughout our country. That act, as it was written in 1964, and it's been amended a couple of times, really tried to protect against racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination, and eventually discrimination based on sex as well, as amended in 1972. The Equality Act would really insert a phrase there. It would define sex and define it as sexual orientation or gender identity as well. And so it would treat that category just as protected from discrimination as the things that I mentioned previously. It would apply to things like public accommodations, which would include things like hotels, restaurants, open to the public kinds of businesses. It would also apply to lending and bank transactions, and it would apply, of course, to educational institutions as well. It is a broad, far-sweeping piece of legislation that would truly, in many ways, redefine a lot of how we interact in the United States of America.
Well, and it's a contentious piece of legislation. There's concerns and controversy. What are the greatest concerns, and are fears well founded?
You know, I think for me, the greatest concern is that the act as it stands right now has really no protection for religious liberties. The original Civil Rights Act of 1964 contains some protections for religious organizations. You know, as I said there, that language, even in 1964, protects against religious discrimination. Well, you know, I teach at a Christian university. We want to have the latitude to hire and fire people based on our own religious beliefs, on our own doctrinal commitments. Technically, that is religious discrimination, you know, as we would define it by the law normally. But the law understands that as a religious organization, we need to have the freedom to define for ourselves how we want to view the world, how we want to minister, and how we want to even live in our own communities. The Equality Act has no such language in place. There really is no language for protection for religious organizations whatsoever. And in fact, it even goes farther than that. It takes some of the existing federal law and it hollows it out and really weakens it in light of the Equality Act. And so this legislation, if passed in its current form, would create an awful lot of conflict between religious organizations and the LGBTQ plus community, as well as between that community and then Christians and other religious individuals who are in the business world, who are in the medical world, and a variety of other fields. You know, I usually try to be even keeled and objective and detached, and I don't buy into scaremongering. I don't really like culture war rhetoric because I think it's often unhelpful. But this is a significant piece of legislation, and if passed in this condition, it'd create serious conflict. We'd be entering into a new phase of the so-called culture war.
Well, as you say, some suggest it's going way too far too fast. Others say it's time Congress caught up to the rest of the country. There are 21 states that have passed laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So, what's your opinion?
You know, it's a great question. And honestly, as Christians, we don't ask this question enough of ourselves because we tend to look at this in a defensive way and see the legislation merely as an act to attack what we believe. The reality, though, is that public opinions have changed pretty dramatically in the last quarter century as it relates to sexual orientation, and now apparently as it relates to transgenderism also. And I think I hope for most Christians when I say I don't really look forward to the opportunity of seeing fellow citizens discriminated against when it comes to things like securing housing or pursuing educational opportunities. I don't think any of us really have a problem with enacting some kind of legislation that would protect those individuals from particular kinds of discrimination. And so, in that sense, I think this is maybe a past due. Maybe we really do need some kind of legislative understanding and some sort of protection for individuals. At the same time, this does feel like it's going way too fast when you hollow out religious liberty. When the First Amendment is kind of defanged in this whole process, this really is something to be concerned about. And so, yes, it's going to create conflict, but it's also something like this is going to happen sooner or later. Of course, the devil will be in the details of what actually takes place in that bill when it passes.
Well, and that's a tremendous point. I mean, could it pass with amendments? There's not a lot of optimism it's going to pass in the Senate. Is there potential for middle ground? Is compromise not the best route?
I think you're right that as it stands right now, there's really not much chance that it will pass in the Senate. It won't get to that 60 vote threshold that it needs to get to avoid a filibuster. But if language were inserted, robust religious liberty protections, for example, were inserted, then I think you might find some room to compromise. If there was some understanding that female athletes would be protected within their interscholastic competitions and wouldn't be forced to compete against transgender females who find themselves in a position of being physically superior to many of those biological females, if some of those things could be dealt with and compromised on, then I think maybe you could see some legislation make its way forward. Senator Collins from Maine, Senator Romney from Utah, there are others I think who'd be willing to have those conversations. But as the bill stands right now, that's not going to happen.
Well, as you've said earlier, we've seen a shift in public opinion, and today 2% of the House and actually 2% of the Senate identify as LGBTQ. So what impact, if any, does that have on the potential successful passage into law?
I'm not sure that it has a lot of impact necessarily on this particular bill, but there's no question that having individuals like that in Congress has an effect on Congress itself. As you interact with people and as you engage with them, as you get to know them personally, then you begin to maybe change some of your attitudes and maybe some of your past perceptions about individuals and groups. And so in that sense, I think that it does probably smooth the way for some sort of change that takes place in the future. But the real question for me is this going to be done, as you said before, in an attitude of compromise, or is this going to be done in an attitude of, well, it's our turn to win, and it's our turn to have power and to use that power for our benefit? And so the attitude that's taken on both sides, I think, will define where this goes.
Well, the Equality Act has been at the forefront of the LGBTQ plus civil rights movement for more than half a century. So the Supreme Court ruling in June of 2020 extended workplace protections to LGBTQ plus Americans. Do you think that's indicative of future Supreme Court rulings?
I think it's a tremendous question because the court's interesting. We often think that we can predict the court, that we see, well, there are 6 relatively conservative justices, 3 relatively liberal justices right now. So it's pretty easy to predict what the court's going to do. Well, the Bostock decision that you're referring to from last year was written by Neil Gorsuch. And it was seen by most of the LGBTQ plus community as a significant victory for them. It was seen by many conservatives as a significant defeat. And so predicting what the court's going to do is always dicey, I think. However, if I rub my crystal ball and if I think about how the court might approach these issues moving forward, I think there's a real possibility if something like the Equality Act passes, the court, I think, will go out of its way to protect religious organizations, schools like where I teach, churches, parachurch organizations, institutions with a purely religious mission and ministry that can define themselves theologically. My guess is they're going to be really well protected by this court. However, if I look at Gorsuch's opinion, I think of some other dynamics on the court, I think it's also possible you're going to see some victories for the LGBTQ community when it comes to businesses and public accommodations. And that will probably end up affecting people, like Jack Phillips, the famous baker from Denver, who's been in this controversy over baking wedding cakes for quite a long time. or Baronelle Stutzman, the Washington florist who's been in this controversy over whether or not she has to provide floral arrangements for same-sex marriages. For people like that, that would put them in a really difficult spot. It might force them to either go along with what's being done or to suffer the consequences. But if I had to guess, it wouldn't surprise me if the court kind of splits the difference. Really strong protection for religious organizations and entities, significant protection against discrimination for the LGBTQ community within the public space.
Well, we will be watching as all of this unfolds. Dr. Smith, once again, thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise with us here at NewsPoint 360. We really appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure.